Welcome to the Breast Cancer Network Australia interview, Genetic Testing Family Considerations. My name is Megan Walker, your host. I have the pleasure of being joined by Dr. Michael Gattas, who is a clinical geneticist with Brisbane Genetics. Hello, Michael, and welcome.
Thank you, Megan. Hello.
So this is our second interview in a series of 3. And if you've missed the first one, have a look for it. I'm sure it's located closely to where this one is housed. The first interview, we covered all the basics of understanding genetic testing for almost, from a beginner's perspective. This conversation, Dr. Gattas and I are going to go through family considerations in a bit more of an advanced level. So, Michael, if you're happy, just kick us off with a little bit of the background in case people haven't watched that first video of what is genetic testing.
So usually in the context of breast cancer, people are referring to testing of the 2 genes called BRCA1 and BRCA2, and that testing has been available clinically now for over 20 years. Most people have heard of those 2 genes, and they're important because they're risk factors for developing breast cancer and ovarian cancer. If you do have a parent, a mother or father with the gene fault, and it can be passed to their children, then that risk is a 50% chance of it being passed down.
Okay. And so if a person has found out or been diagnosed with breast cancer, is genetic testing recommended?
In some situations, yes, and it's important in management for that patient, for example, whether she would benefit from preventive mastectomy or having ovaries taken out, but also important then in terms of screening for at-risk family members, and I guess that's the focus of the conversation. So it's particularly the first-degree relatives, brothers, sisters, parents, and it is important to remember parents to go back and test them if you possibly can. And of course, most people are very mindful of what it may mean for their children as well.
Okay. And when you're talking to patients about their genetic testing, what are some of the family considerations that you suggest to them?
It really depends a lot on who's concerned in the family and how close you are to some family members. So family dynamics play a big role in how information will be shared. Most parents certainly would be in close contact with their children, but not always. And so what I often say to people in that situation, if you do have a gene fault that's discovered, pick the easy people first. In other words, the ones you're closest to, the ones who already know you're being tested, pick those ones to share that information with. Then the choice is up to them as to whether they want to be tested or not. But if you don't tell them that this has been found, then they're not really able to make that choice for themselves. So it is a bit of a case you can lead the horse to water, but then the horse really has to do the drinking themselves.
Okay, thank you for that. And can you tell us what's involved in getting a genetic test done? Is it bone marrow? Is it a day in hospital? What's involved?
Look, it's a blood test in most instances, or sometimes even saliva. So the process of testing is really very straightforward. You do need a referral from a GP to a specialist, though. So currently, the Medicare rebate, perhaps that's an important point to make, from 1 November last year, if you have a family member with a known BRCA1 or BRCA2 gene defect, Medicare will now pay for that testing. So there's no cost to get the testing done, but it does have to be requested by a specialist. So your GP can refer you either to a public genetic clinic, a family cancer clinic, or a specialist such as genetic counselor, myself, for example, or sometimes a breast surgeon or oncologist are increasingly doing this testing as well.
Okay. And I have heard that there's, you see on Facebook and some websites that talk about mail order genetic testing. As a layperson, I don't know whether that's what that involves, but they seem to be very low cost. Are there risks with going down that path and getting that sort of testing done?
Yes, is the short answer to that. So offshore testing isn't really regulated by the same quality assurance standards. So it's always difficult to know, is the test going to be accurate and is what they're reporting real? And even with our own pathology laboratories, if we discover a gene fault, nearly always we will check it with a repeat blood sample, not because the lab does get them wrong very often, but you are looking at preventative surgery. Mastectomy is major surgery based on that result. So we nearly always want to double check it before you took that step. And the problem with the direct-to-consumer testing is you have no easy way to assess the quality assurance of the lab at the other end. So I would be very hesitant about using that information for guiding medical care. The stakes are too high. You can use it for things like ancestry testing or just out of interest, but I really would advise people not to use a internet purchase test just to guide whether they're going to get breast cancer or not.
Okay. And so the typical channels are you go to your GP, you get a referral to a clinical geneticist, someone like yourself, and you get the gene testing done, if that's, correct me if I'm wrong. And then what do you do with the results?
Well, hopefully it will guide whether you're at increased risk or not, so you get a yes or a no answer, and that should be true if there's a known gene fault in your family. There's quite a lot of people, though, we test with breast cancer, and it is perhaps an important point to make. Ideally, when we start the testing, we start with the person who's had the cancer. They're our best chance of finding the fault, and even if that person has an abnormality, their children have a 50-50 chance that they won't have it. So if you know what you're looking for, the testing is really that cut and dried. You can say, yes, you've got it, or no, you haven't. But if the cause remains unexplained in your family, then you're not really at low risk just because you tested negative. So it is important you don't drop your guard or become more complacent about screening if you have no abnormality found, unless we can tell you that you really are at low risk or average risk because we've found you don't have that mutation. So I hope that answers that question.
Absolutely. I want to give you a question without notice, Michael, that I hope you don't mind. But,
No?
you know, I as a layperson, again, you hear snippets of things in women's magazines about this person or that celebrity finding out that they've had, they've got breast cancer and then they've had a double mastectomy or they've had a hysterectomy or they've done something like that. Is that kind of like the next step for someone who comes back with? Do you have to go down that path?
No, nor do you have to appear in New Idea or the Next Women's magazine either. It is something that some women do as a preventative step, and it is certainly discussed with most women when they're in a high-risk situation. But in my experience and sort of collectively, most women really don't want to have preventive mastectomy. It's an important quality of life issue. For women who get breast cancer, we'll try and do breast-sparing surgery where possible. So we also have good evidence that early detection works for breast cancer. So at the very least, we increase the level of surveillance. That can include things like breast MRI, again, Medicare funded if you're less than 50, on the basis of early detection. The women who do perhaps go down the risk-reducing mastectomy pathway, in my experience, more commonly it's when they've got young children and they've finished their breastfeeding. So they don't want to get sick while their children need a mother. And so it becomes quite a powerful motivating factor, which I think is probably true with Angelina Jolie, for example, the most famous person who had the mastectomies in 2013. She had young children and she didn't want to die for her children's sake. So it is something that tends to happen at that stage of your life, but not always.
Okay. And I've got two questions left. One is about the results, and will the gene testing do any sort of prediction of other cancers that a person with breast cancer could get in the future? And Michael, then also, once we've talked about that, we'll talk about the insurance side of things as well, and if that's okay.
Certainly, genes BRCA1 and BRCA2 are important for breast cancer and ovarian cancer in women. So most women who get breast cancer do not develop ovarian cancer because most women with breast cancer don't have a BRCA1 or BRCA2 gene defect. But if you are unlucky enough to have that gene defect, it becomes very important to have surgery to remove ovaries and fallopian tube. That doesn't tend to get the same sort of attention as going down the mastectomy pathway, but it's clearly beneficial, and it's clearly something you do once you've finished having your children, maybe about the age of 40, for example. So men can get prostate cancer, particularly with BRCA2. There's some association with that, and there's a slight risk of pancreatic cancer, again, particularly with BRCA2, which again is not easily detected or something you can do a lot about. But in absolute terms, those other cancers are quite low risk compared to breast ovarian cancer. Some of the other breast cancer genes can be associated with a wider variety of cancers, things like the TP53 gene, but fortunately it's much less common than BRCA1 or BRCA2.
Okay. And then wrap us up to close, Michael, with people who might not have heard the first video, just about insurance implications going forth with genetic testing.
it's nearly always something we raise at the point of the consultation and talking through pros and cons of gene testing, and that can take up to 45 minutes, that type of pre-test counselling. And the important point to make is that existing policies aren't affected. So in other words, if you've already got some life insurance and income protection insurance, your policy doesn't change on the basis of any gene testing result. So the message there, if people think they may want to get insurance or they're thinking of having some gene testing, get your insurance before you do your gene test. Unfortunately, even the discovery of a gene fault in your family, even if you've never even been tested, that piece of information alone can make it harder to get some life insurance or income protection insurance. So it makes no difference to medical insurance is an important point. So if you've already got medical insurance or you apply for medical insurance, they can't knock you back or you can't pay extra based on the gene testing result, at least as our medical insurance exists in Australia.
Okay, great. Michael, thank you so much for sharing all your wisdom and knowledge on this interview. If patients are listening and they're wanting to get more information from you, you do a teleconsultation as well with. Just explain that service.
Whilst I'm based in Brisbane, video consultation, a bit like we're doing this interview, for example, it's become quite commonplace for people in regional Queensland, but it does mean that you can access advice and gene testing through blood samples, for example, wherever you happen to live. So it is quite important for people in regional and rural parts of Australia to know that they can also be seen thanks to these sort of video conferencing technologies. Still, they need a referral from a local GP. That's all it requires.
Okay, fantastic. So Dr. Michael Gattas from Brisbane Genetics, thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it.